We're going to go over some settings, customizations, as well as button layout on the Canon R6 Mark II. And these settings are something that I personally use for everyday work that I think is very useful and helpful for different varieties of shoots that you might encounter. A lot of these are kind of like shortcuts where you don't have to dig inside the menu and try to find the setting again and adjust accordingly to your shoot. However, do keep in mind that these settings are what works for me. Yours might be different. There are different customization dial up here where you can register and save the settings that you like for a certain style of shoot that you do. So I say if you want to give this focus system a try, have it saved to like custom 3 or something. Or you can also adjust it accordingly to your shooting style whenever you're trying out this system. So let's go over to the first page of the autofocus section. At the very bottom, I have the switching tracked subject to 0. The reason being is because I don't want the focus to switch to a new subject right away if someone walks in front of the camera. I want the camera to be focusing on the initial subject that I had it on. And as you see, I have the eye detection set to disable, which we'll talk more about it in just a bit here. Let's go ahead and move on to page 3. The very first one is the one-shot autofocus release priority. I have this set to focus. Basically what this means is that your shutter is not going to be released unless you have something in focus. So vice versa, if you have the setting set to release, the shutter will release no matter if you have focus or not. Most of the time I have this setting to focus. However, I do play around with the settings whenever I'm doing street photography because focusing and not focusing, it really depends on the scene and situation. Sometimes things happen very fast on the street. And in that kind of situation, I'd rather to have the shot more than to have anything that I want in focus in the first place. It's more about like capturing the moment, for me at least, when I'm doing street photography. But honestly, the focus system on the R6 Mark II is fabulous. So I say it really depends on the situation on the street, whether you want to use release or focus. Moving on to preview autofocus, I believe this used to be called continuous autofocus, which is actually makes sense, but now the preview autofocus is a bit confusing. However, I have it off because basically if you have it on, whenever you're not trying to get focus, the camera will continuously, well, hence the name continuous autofocus before they change the name here. It'll just keep on hunting and looking for things to focus, even though you're not really trying to shoot or anything. And that's why I have it off all the time, because whenever I need to shoot or I need focus, I'll do it myself. I don't really need for the camera to like automatically hunting for it all the time. Moving on to the next one, and that is the autofocus assist beam. I have this off all the time as well, especially for street photography. What this does is that it shoots out this orange kind of looking beam to assist with focus. And I personally don't find that useful, at least for the type of shoot that I do. And the beams that it fires off is just very distracting for street photography as well. That's why I just keep it off all the time. By the way, if you like street photography or just photography in general, check out my Instagram and maybe start a photography conversation over there. And if you like what you're seeing, maybe drop a follow or something. Moving on to page 4, the touch and drag autofocus setting. I have this enabled because I find this very useful to adjust focus whenever you're shooting on the go or you're like moving around for events, portraits, or even street photography. The name explains exactly what it does. You can adjust focus on the LCD screen here whenever you have your eye against the viewfinder. Now I have the setting to relative because it feels very natural and fast for me to adjust the focus. And as for the active touch area, I have it set to right because I tend to use my right eye to look at the viewfinder, which means I have more space on the right side of the screen and my thumb can kind of like get into the screen and adjust the focus like that. I would assume if you're using your left eye as your dominant eye to focus or look through the viewfinder, it'll be a lot easier if you have the touch area on the left side of the screen. This way your face is not blocking this part of the screen. And I have the sensitivity set to 0, but you can adjust that according to your likings. Now the Canon R6 Mark II has a joystick, which I love, but I actually find the touch and drag focus a lot faster than using the joystick to move the focus around, which is something I never thought I would actually say because I like the tactile feeling of the button and adjusting with the button. And using the screen to adjust focus was a little weird at first, but it's really intuitive once you started using it. Moving on to the next page, I have the manual focus peaking setting on, where the level is high and I have the color in red. You can adjust any kind of color you want. I personally just find the red a bit more prominent on the screen, so it's a lot easier for me to identify which part of the photo is in focus. Next, I have the focus guide on. This is where when you're doing manual focus, you'll see like 3 different points. As long as the bottom 2 are lined up together and shows green, you're in focus. And I find this super helpful whenever using manual focus. Either you're taking silhouette shot or backlit photo where focus can be a bit tricky. This is where this function comes in handy. Any type of shot that requires you to switch to manual focus, you'll see this focus guide appear to assist with your focus. Moving on to page 6, over here I have the lens electronic manual focus to on, and specifically on one shot enabled. And this allows me to take a shot and half press on the button here and adjust the focus. So essentially I switch to manual focus right away whenever I half press and hold it there, and I can adjust the focus manually. Where you can see on the screen it flashes manual focus, and I can have the focus distance scale down at the bottom along with the focus guide in place that tells me if I'm in focus or not. And on top of that, you can also see the manual focus peak in red, which we turned on earlier. And all of these are super helpful if you're trying to take a shot that is very hard to focus. Maybe it's like low light or silhouette photo, or if the line of the subject is just very blurry and the camera is just having a hard time to focus. And this way you can switch to manual focus in no time without having to switch to manual focus on your lens and forgetting to switch it back to autofocus when you need to shoot again. Now let's talk about some buttons that I made changes to regarding focus. The first one is the asterisk button right here behind your thumb. Well, in front of, well, around your thumb. I don't know why I said behind my thumb. Anyhow, I have this button set to switch between one shot and servo. This way I can toggle between the two seamlessly. And yes, there is an AI servo now built in with the Canon R6 Mark II, even the Canon R8 I believe, but personally I still find that it's easier and faster, I guess perhaps in a way more accurate as well if I change this accordingly to what I'm shooting at the moment, instead of relying on AI to determine if we should be using one shot or servo. Plus, having this toggle here is super fast to switch between one shot and servo, in my opinion. And for those of you who don't know, one shot is whenever you're taking photos of something that's stationary, and as of servo is whenever your subject is moving around, such as if you're shooting sports or any of the action shots that you need to get. Servo will basically keep on changing the focus depending on the movements of the subject. Next button I changed on the Canon R6 Mark II is the autofocus on button. For the longest time I had this button for back button focus, and you can still achieve that if you're used to that simply by changing the shutter button to metering start, and then go to autofocus on button and change that for autofocus. But since the autofocus on today's mirrorless camera is so good, I actually have the autofocus on button set to eye detection. Essentially what this does is whenever I press the autofocus on button and hold on to it, it'll start tracking the eye of my subject. And on top of that, if I'm in servo mode, I can just hold on to the autofocus on button and it'll continuously track the eye wherever my subject moves. And the eye detection tracking is pretty impeccable on this camera. As long as you have the right camera setting for the environment, it's very hard to get a blurry shot. And the reason why I like to use this button for eye detection is because whenever I don't need to track people's eye, if I'm not taking portrait photos all of a sudden, switching between different types of photo, I simply don't have to press and hold on the autofocus on. I can go back to just taking shots with the shutter normally. For example, maybe it's like a stationary subject, or maybe it's a portrait shot. I don't want the eyes or face to be focused. I want the magazine in front of it to be focused. I can quickly do the drag and touch focus and focus on the magazine and then move back to eye detection by simply pressing autofocus on right away. It'll automatically focus on the eye of the subject. This gives me a lot of options without having to dig into the menu and change the setting and then start shooting again. With all of these settings, it's really fast and easy to adjust your settings for focus right away in your fingertips.